Let's pray. Father, thank you for this morning. You're good to us. You give us life, and we are just thankful for the fact that you give us your word, you give us spiritual life, Lord, that you have united us to Christ, your Son, that, Lord, today we can once again remind ourselves of the fact that in him we have full forgiveness of our sin, and, Lord, you have given us grace for today and for every day, Lord. Thank you for our study. We pray you'll enlighten our hearts and minds, that your Spirit will make true to us your word, and that we'll see Christ. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, guys, glad you're here this morning. A couple of things. One, I just wanted to thank John. Just so you guys know, the room is a mess. Has been a mess every week as we're trying to get things together as they're doing all this work. And John has come in like early this morning and blew the whole room out and set it up. And so just to acknowledge that. So also, thanks for being here. It's the last Deeper until the fall. So when will we start again? In August. I don't know the date in August yet. But this is the last one until then. We're going to finish Genesis today. Assuming I actually do what I set out to do, and we finish Genesis today, it's the last one till the fall. I might revoke that if I don't. But that's the goal. And then we're going to roll into Exodus. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They're going to come at you a little more quickly, though still fairly slowly compared to some other sections of the Bible. The fact is, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books are so foundational to biblical theology that I have to take my time there. There are other books that we'll move through a little quicker and even bigger chunks. But let me do this. We're gonna turn really to the story of Joseph and Judah today, and we're gonna start in Genesis 37. We're gonna largely look at a basic overview of Joseph's story. Our plan, and how Judah fits into it, our plan is not to read all this section and not to talk about every story in this section. So here's what I want to do, though. I want to come back to and remind you of some of the themes we've been hitting as we've been moving through Genesis. So let's go back to the mother promise, the proto-evangelion, the first gospel, the mother promise. What is it? Anybody? What's that?
Seed of the woman, crush the seed of the...
Okay. Yeah, there's going to be enmity between the seed of Satan and the seed of the woman. The seed of the woman will crush his head, and he'll bruise that seed's heel. That's the mother promise, this promise of this seed of the woman who's to come. It's important to always keep that in mind. And there's conflict always between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. There's always this conflict, but this seed of the woman is to come. He's reversing, really, the effects of the fall, of the curse that has come upon man. Man was originally commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, to be a priest king in God's garden, and really to spread the bounds of God's garden across the earth so that God's glorious image is seen all around the earth. But man fails in that, and as he falls into sin at the temptation of Satan, then God gives this curse, and in the midst of this curse is this promise, the first gospel. Now, we see that story carry out until that first gospel is made even more clear under a covenant with who? You remember? Abraham. Thank you, Jeff. It's even made even more clear under the covenant with Abraham. So that covenant with Abraham emphasizes, really, we get the promise initially in Genesis 12, and the covenant pushed in more flavor and color in Genesis 15 and 17 and even 22. But if you're looking just at Genesis 12, what were the 3 major parts of that covenant, or 3 major promises? I've just been hitting you with them over and over again. So, what were they? Land, seed, blessing. Okay? Land, seed, blessing. And it's not just blessing for Abraham and his offspring, but it's blessing for Abraham and his offspring, and through his offspring to the nations. You guys follow that? Okay, to the nations. And so land, seed, blessing to the nations. All right. We move through Abraham's story as we saw the conflict back and forth as the seed of the serpent in some ways competing always with the seed of the woman. We move through that as Abraham tries to make fleshly attempts to bring about the seed. And then God says, no, we're going to do this supernaturally through Sarah, your wife. And then we get Abraham's son, Isaac. We see some of the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, his son through Hagar and his son through Sarah. And then we get Isaac, and then we eventually get Jacob. And we looked at Jacob more last week. And now we're into Jacob's 12 sons. Okay, with Isaac you had Jacob and Esau. We looked at some of that story. And now we're into Jacob's 12 sons. And the emphasis here in Jacob's 12 sons, interestingly enough, I talked about last week, 2 of them becoming disqualified. You guys remember that? They become disqualified to be the heirs. Who are they? What's that? Levi and Reuben and Simeon, by the way. 3 of his sons do, but 2 of them together in what instance? What happened?
They killed the people that raped them.
Yeah, so their sister was raped, Dinah was raped, and what do? They say, get circumcised, and then they, you can be one with us. They basically trick them, and then they murder them all. And Jacob, when he gives his blessing in Genesis 49, says it's because of essentially their bloodlust and their lying, and so they can't be the heirs. All right, so we see some of that story come in. We also see the story come in, and we'll look more at that promise in a minute. But now we're going to turn to Joseph. Joseph really being essentially Jacob's youngest son, the son whom he really puts sets his love on Joseph. Joseph, however, is not. Now I want you to get this. Joseph is not Jacob's primary son as regards the heir. Joseph is not the heir. Joseph plays an incredibly important role in Genesis and the story of Israel, but Joseph is not the heir. So though from chapter 37 to chapter 50, the story centers largely on Joseph, he's not Jacob's heir. And that's important to keep in mind. So let's look at chapter 37 and start to read about Joseph. Really, we'll largely read through chapters 37 and 38 and then kind of jump from there. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And the man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, cast him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that they might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Now, notice that it's not unimportant that the Ishmaelites are coming along now and picking up Joseph. This is the son who's opposing the family of Isaac, right? Ishmael. He's going to carry Joseph off into slavery, and interestingly enough, it's going to be the Ishmaelites carrying them off into slavery, and then later Egypt, the one who enslaves Joseph, really, who ends up saving Israel's life. Interestingly, right? Their opposition is the one who ends up being, in some way, playing a part in delivering them. Verse 28, then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him up out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it's your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Okay, so I don't want to read the entire story of Joseph. You guys know this story, right? So let's use this as our jumping off point. Joseph tells his brothers, "You're all going to bow to me." It's not usually popular to tell your siblings, "One day I will rise up and you will all bow before me." But here's, okay, Drew probably tries that at home, but this is the youngest of the siblings, so it would have to be the youngest of the Hepner boys to say that. But so here he rises up, says, "One day I'm going to rise up and you're all going to bow before me." And they think you're absolutely crazy. They already hate him because his father really adores him, right? Because Jacob really adores him. So they already hate Joseph, and they basically conspire to kill him. Rather than killing him, they sell him into slavery. He's then sold into slavery, and he ends up in Potiphar's house. What happens from there, guys? What happens from there in the story of Joseph? Because I want to condense these 13 chapters or whatever. What happens from there? Okay? So it starts out sort of finding favor and rising up until what happens? Until Potiphar's wife tries to allure him sexually. He flees. He gets accused anyway. Right? And then what occurs? Goes to prison. Now, he's a dreamer. It's important to know that. They start calling him that. His brothers call him that in like a derogatory sense, right? Let's throw the dreamer in the pit, you know? So they don't like him. But he has these dreams that are prophetic. And he has essentially the ability to interpret the dreams of other people as God gives him ability. And so he's in prison. And there are these visions to be had, right? That are being had, these dreams that are happening. And Pharaoh wants someone to interpret them. You guys familiar with this? Okay? It's not the only time in the Bible, by the way, where one of God's prophets, if you will, Joseph really is playing the role of prophet here, is raised up into leadership because of his ability to interpret prophecy or dreams. Right? That happens. Can you guys think of another character that happens to? Daniel, right? Okay. So this happens. So the king has these dreams. This is God sovereignly giving these dreams to his king for the purpose of raising up his people, right? And so he gives Pharaoh these dreams, and Joseph then tells the dreams, the interpretation, and you guys remember the story. He gets left in prison longer than he should. Eventually, to make a long story short, he gets out. It's found out that he's the one interpreting these dreams, right? He rises up in Pharaoh's house. One of the dreams is about what? The primary dream of the story that Pharaoh has that Joseph interprets is about what? What's that? Okay, about a famine that's coming in that whole part of the earth. Now, Egypt, so you know, at this point in time, is the most powerful kingdom on the earth. They're it. So I think one of the things that we often think about, we think about Egypt now. Egypt is so small now on a world scale. We think about the Roman Empire, we think there is a big, powerful empire, right? Maybe if we think about the British Empire, we think there was a big, powerful empire on a little tiny island, right? But one of the most powerful empires in the history of the world. Egypt was like that in their day. They were the most powerful empire in the world at the time. And Joseph essentially says to Pharaoh, there's a big famine coming. Let's store up all this stuff in barns to prepare for the famine so that essentially we can then care for all these nations, right, around us. They can come, they can buy from you, people can buy from you. And what's going to happen to Pharaoh as they buy from him in the famine?
He's rich.
He's going to get richer, right? Okay? So Joseph prepares for this whole thing. Interestingly, as a result of Joseph being sold into slavery by his brothers, as a result of Joseph being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, as a result of Joseph spending time in prison for that, and then Joseph rising up, he ends up rising up to power in Egypt. And what is he able to then do? As a result of his power in Egypt, what is he able to then do? Which is really the key to the story here. Save his brothers. He's able to save Israel. It's interesting that it becomes the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, the Egyptians, whom God sovereignly works through, right, to save his people, Israel. It becomes the sin of Joseph's own brothers that leads to their own salvation from a famine. You guys follow that? This is one of the probably most profound elements of this whole story. It's repeated twice, and we'll come to it in a little bit. The profound element of this whole story is, never says, you meant it for evil and God used it for good. You guys ever hear that phrase? Okay? It never says that in the text. It says, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. In other words, he didn't just look and go, oh, they did something evil. What should I do with that? Okay? He intended it. He intended their sin to be the means through which they become delivered. Which is just a, mind-blowing concept. We'll get to in a minute.
Here's more to the story here, like forgiveness and...
Oh, yeah. Joseph ends up, obviously forgives his brothers, and
You say Joseph didn't have temptation for revenge would be. Can you imagine the temptation he had?
oh, I can't even imagine how much Joseph thought when he was there as
Revenge,
he lets them, he lets them feed. Yeah. What'd you say? What'd you say, Joel?
He sweats them.
Yeah, he sweats them out a little bit. He lets them sweat it out a little bit, right? And so you have to have some appreciation for that part of the story as you're reading the narrative, as he lets them sweat it out a little bit. But he doesn't take revenge on them. So here comes the question in the middle of this whole story. You have chapter 37, and then really chapter 39 and following is continuing to pick up the story. But all of a sudden, in the middle of this, chapter 38 drops in. And scholars wrestle with this. Why in the world in the middle of this Joseph story, do we have this story in chapter 38? And some scholars, liberal scholars, want to come in and say it's a later sort of interpolation brought in by an editor. So some editor came along later and threw this story in, and it's out of place. And I think that's because they don't know how to read well. Okay, honestly, they're not paying attention. So let's look at chapter 38, because chapter 38 is wild. And I want to ask you as we read this chapter, which I just really want to read through it, I want to ask you, why does chapter 38 come in and interrupt this story? Because it's like an interruption in the story. You're having the story of Joseph. He's in Potiphar's house. That's where you're left. And then all of a sudden it just full stop Joseph's story. Tell the story in chapter 38, and then we move on in chapter 39 back to Joseph's story. Look at chapter 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Notice that it picks up again with Joseph in Potiphar's house. Look at the end of chapter 37, verse 36. Chapter 37, verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. You see how it seems like chapter 39 should follow right on the heels of chapter 37, doesn't it? Here he's sold to Potiphar's house, and now in chapter 39, you pick up Joseph in Potiphar's house. You guys follow me on that? So why does chapter 38 come in? So let's read it. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her. You understand, it's a discreet way talking about this. And she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Shezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife from his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So he takes a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground, so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up," for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. he turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He answered, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." And she said, "If you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give to you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. And he asked the men of the place, "Where is the cult prostitute who was at Anaim at the roadside?" And they said, "No cult prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I've not found her." Also the men of the place said, "No cult prostitute has been here." And Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being, it's just harsh. Doesn't even know his own behavior, right? As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "By the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant." And she said, "Please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. When the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made of yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez. Afterward his brother came out with a scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Now Joseph was in Potiphar's house. What a strange story to throw in to the middle of Joseph's story, isn't it? I mean, I know when you're reading Genesis, you don't stop and consider, I just read about Joseph and his whole thing. Now he's in Potiphar's house. And now we're going to go on to the next part of Joseph in Potiphar's house. Nope, we're going to stop and take a break on this weird story of Judah having sons, his sons dying of wickedness, his daughter-in-law basically being taken advantage of by his first son, his second son, and then by her father-in-law, by Judah. All right, why is it here? Why is it here? Let me ask you this first. What kind of woman is Tamar? What is her ethnicity? Huh?
Canaanite.
What's that?
Is she a Canaanite?
Yeah, she's from the area of the Canaanites. She is a Jew or a Gentile? She's a Gentile. She is not a Jew. Okay? First thing to recognize, she's a Gentile woman. All right? Does she believe in the promise of the seed less than or more than even Judah does and his sons? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because here you have her going out of her way to do what? What's she going out of her way to do? What'd you say? To get pregnant. To get pregnant. She's doing whatever she has to do to get pregnant. Judah, his sons, are refusing essentially to get her pregnant, dying of wickedness. And then Judah's supposed to give her to his third son, right? But he withholds the third son, or with her from the third son, and leaves her in widowhood. And there seems to be some sense in which Tamar recognizes she must have a child, which is a strange thing for this Gentile woman in the midst of the story. Now, what does Judah give to Tamar as surety? What's he give her as surety? What's that? Signet ring. What else? His staff. Okay, gives her a staff. He gives her a staff as surety. Now, when he's found out, not just her, right, that's pregnant, but when he's found out, what does he get back? He gets back his surety, right? His staff, his signet ring, etc. All right, I want you to remember that for a minute. In a minute. But let me ask you this question. Why is the story here? Why the story about this Gentile woman in the middle of Joseph's story? About this Gentile woman. Yes?
With the seeds, again, I guess it's fresh again, but it's all about the emphasis on the promise of the seed.
Yeah, there's a huge emphasis on the promise of the seed, isn't there? The seed of the woman. Huge emphasis on the promise of the seed of the woman. Just drops in here. And what we need to understand is there's an emphasis on Judah as well. On Judah as well. Because the seed of the woman needs to come through Judah. Okay? Can Judah's other sons be the seed of the woman? Can his other sons be the seed of the woman? They're in this story. Can they be the seed of the woman? Well, why do they keep dying? Why did the first two die? Wickedness. Okay, his first two sons die of wickedness. Can they be, when you die of wickedness, I mean, we're all going to die of wickedness in the ultimate sense, but when the Bible's declaring of you, I'm just tired of your wickedness, I'm taking you out, right? That's what God's saying, okay? Not good, okay? Two of his sons die basically because God is tired of their wickedness, right? The third son, Judah's withholding a wife from. So can the seed come through Judah's sons? Or be one of Judah's sons? No, right? The seed of the woman can't be one of Judah's sons. And so he's got to have the seed of the woman. Why does he have to come from Judah? So let's keep your hand there and go forward to Genesis 49. Genesis 49. And I want to pick up on a lot of this language. Then look at verse 1. Then Jacob called his sons. Now this is, mind you, they've essentially been saved through the famine by Joseph, okay, in Egypt. And Jacob calls them together to give the blessing before he dies. This is the one scene in Jacob's life in which the author of Hebrews says he had faith, right? All right. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen in the days to come." Interestingly is that I don't like the way the ESV translates this, the days to come. Does anybody have a different version? What do you have?
Assemble yourselves that I may tell you what will befall you in the days to come.
In the days to come. Anybody have anything other than the days to come? Anybody got an NASB in here?
That was an
And that's NASB? What about King James, New King James? What does it have? Anybody have that? Nobody cares anything but ESV, pretty much? Yeah. I have a friend in Louisville who says that churches, a lot of churches have become ES-vegans, right? It's all they eat. And he's like, you got to look at other versions. What?
King James says last days. Shall befall you in the last days.
Shall befall you in the last days, a better translation, actually. Probably the best translation of it is the latter days or the last days. This is the Hebrew phrase for the latter days or the last days. In other words, he's giving a prophecy about what? To his sons about the last days, the latter days. This is a technical, prophetic term, an eschatological term, pressing forward to the latter days. It's used next where? Anybody know? Next time this phrase, the latter days, is used in the Bible. Anybody know? It's in Numbers. Numbers is the next time it's used. Numbers 24, so look there. Numbers 24. And I want you to keep your hand in Genesis and then in Numbers as well. Genesis 49, Numbers, because we're going to come back and forth a little bit. But look at Numbers 24, verse 13. But Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear of it. Excuse me, Numbers 20, I'm in the wrong passage. Numbers 24, that's me announcing that, and then I turned to the wrong one. All right. Numbers 24 and verse 14. And now, behold, I am going to my people. Come, I will let you know what this people will do to your people in the what? Latter days. Okay? In the last days. It's the next time that phrase is used. The latter days, the last days. It's picked up, by the way, again, by way of example, in Isaiah chapter 2. Look there. Isaiah chapter 2. So you know this is a continually used phrase. And verse 2, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the highest of the mountains, etc. Okay? These last days or latter days, that is the same phrase that's in Genesis 14. Now I want you to keep your hand in Numbers 24 because we're going to come back to it. What I want to establish, though, is that the first time this phrase is used in the Bible, latter days or last days, in other words, first time we start talking about eschatology in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 49. Eschatology does not begin in Revelation. Right? And if you understand eschatology, you understand eschatology is how the story drives to its end. It isn't just concerned with the very end of things, but how the story is driving to its end. The story has a goal that it's going toward. So we're told, gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come, or the latter days. Now look at Genesis 49:2. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength. Preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Remember, Reuben went and slept with one of Jacob's wives. And so he becomes disqualified. You sleep with your father's wife at this point, you're going to be disqualified from the inheritance. Your father's probably not going to take it well, right? So that's what happened to Reuben. He's out. He's the firstborn son. Who should be primogenitor? Who should be the firstborn who inherits everything? The firstborn, right? That's what the word means. But Reuben is disqualified because of his sin. Now look at verse 5. Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. What's he referring to? The situation with Dinah where they go and slaughter this town. Let my soul come not into their counsel, O my glory be not joined to their company, for in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Levi becomes a tribe of the Levites. They get no portion of the land. The Lord is their inheritance. And then Simeon's portion is divided up as well. But let's look at Judah. Judah, verse 8, picking up from chapter 38, remember? Okay? That strange chapter. Look at here. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. What's he telling him right now about Judah? What's he telling Judah? What's he going to be? If your brothers bow down before you, what are you? Okay, you're the heir. You're a king. What else? What is the other language here? You're what? Your hand will be where? The neck of your enemies. You think that's picking up any imagery from Genesis 3:15? Where the seed of the woman is going to put his foot really on the devil's neck. Right? Joel's thinking about the same thing I'm thinking about. Sorry. There's a sermon. It's not really a sermon. A travesty by a man named Jesse Duplantis, who's a complete heretic. Complete heretic. Called put your foot up, keep your foot on the devil's neck, right? And it's awful. Yeah. And Joel and I watched it, and we laughed our butts off. All right, anyway, it was terrible. We should have probably wept. But, all right. Now let's continue on in this imagery. Judah, verse 9, is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion, as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? Now, you talk about him being a lion. What are you saying? He's going to be powerful. Don't mess with him, right? All right. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So he's going to hold the scepter. The ruler's staff will not depart from between his feet. Okay. I want to ask a question. What's one of the main things that Judah gives to Tamar as surety? The staff. Right? And then she presents it back to him. And it's really the sons who come from Tamar whom the messianic promise is passed down through. So there's this language being picked up here. Until tribute comes to him, nor this ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. I want to bring this up because I don't like the translation until tribute comes to him either. A lot of your Bibles will have a note, and I think it's a better translation. There's a lot of different arguments as to why, but look at, you see that, does your Bibles have a little footnote next to until tribute comes to him? And if you look down at the bottom or the side or wherever it puts it footnote, it'll give you another translation. By a slight revocalization, a slight emendation yields until he comes to whom it belongs. And I've read several Hebrew scholars that think that is definitely the better translation. So notice that. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. You guys follow the imagery there? In the context of the latter days. Prophecies about the latter days. The scepter shall not depart from him until he comes to whom the scepter belongs. All right. And then look what it says about this one who comes, to whom the scepter belongs. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Not just Israel, but the peoples. The nations. Binding his foal and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. I mean, think about this. You're binding your donkey to a vine that produces grapes. I mean, there's this kind of harmony in nature, is what's being emphasized here. He washed his garments in wine and his vesture in the blood of grapes, which is this emphasis on there's this imagery here, eschatological imagery of how good things are. Things are so good he can wash his clothes in wine. Right? I mean, that's, right? You guys know, the Dumb and Dumber movie? Where the beer flows like wine, right? And the women flock like the salmon of Capistrano. Anyway, okay, all right, yeah. All right. The idea is there's just this overwhelming, not to quote it, this overwhelming peace in the land, right? It's all good when this one comes. All right. Sorry.
I have a question.
He's bringing a great blessing. What's that?
I have a question. Why didn't you pause before you asked that question about Dumb and Dumber?
I don't know, because I didn't want to. I didn't know if I should go there or not. All right, so but listen to this description of Judah. Now, go forward to Numbers 24 again. I told you to go before. You guys remember this story. Balaam is commanded or is being asked to basically pronounce a curse on Israel, right? And it turns. And the curse really becomes a blessing. So look at chapter 24. Let's go down to verse 2. And Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. And he took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces, and pierce them through with his arrows. I mean, this is talking about this conquering of Israel, of the foreign nations, isn't it? And this fruitfulness of their fields. And I wish I had time to get into that like I did in my staff meeting on Tuesday. But when the Spirit comes and what happens. But he crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness who will rouse him up. Now, do you recognize any language here? What's that? Judah. He's this lion, right? Lion tribe of Judah. Who will rouse him up? Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. Where does that language come from? Genesis 12. And Balak's anger was kindled against Balaam, and he struck his hands together, and Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have blessed them these 3 times. I mean, he had no choice. The Spirit of God came upon him. But that's the Lord using it. Therefore now flee to your own place, I said. I will certainly honor you, but the Lord has held you back from honor. And Balaam said to Balak, did I not tell your messengers whom you sent to me, if Balak should give me his house full of silver and gold, I would not be able to go beyond the word of the Lord, to do either good or bad of my own will. What the Lord speaks, that will I speak. And now behold, I am going to my people. Come, I will let you know what this people will do to your people in the what? Latter days. Now notice this, to that phrase latter days is being tied Israel's fortunes, Judah's most specifically. And he took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is open, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eye uncovered. I see him, but now I behold him, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. You guys heard this idea of crushing a head before? Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also his enemy shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. Now, who is this one from Jacob who's coming in the latter days, who is like a lion? Who shall rouse him? Who will crush the head of Moab? You guys follow the language here? It's the Messiah. Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The one who crushes the head of the serpent. The scepter does not depart from him. Now, I want to jump forward to Matthew chapter 1 briefly. Matthew chapter 1. And we get these genealogies that we normally skip because we get bored with them. But they become incredibly important. And the more you understand the Old Testament, the more you understand how important these genealogies are. the book of the genealogy of Jesus, Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Now notice that, Judah and his brothers. The brothers are just thrown in as his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by who? Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, by the way, there's another Gentile woman, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, another Gentile woman, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And then we get into another scandalous section of Jesus' genealogy after that, David having Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Interesting language we'll get to later. Doesn't even call her Bathsheba there, calls her the wife of Uriah, right? Emphasizing David's obvious sin in that situation. And this all leads to Jesus, right? In other words, why is Genesis 38 plopped in the middle of the story of Joseph and his leading Israel to Egypt?
Shows the legitimacy of Jesus' lineage.
Okay, it's showing the legitimacy. We know, I think it's easy to establish why Judah's story is here. It's from Judah that the seed of the woman's going to come. It's from Judah's sin, really, with Tamar, that the seed of the woman's going to come. And we can see the eschatological language as we come to Genesis 49 when Jacob blesses his sons, really toward the end of this story, when he blesses his sons, about the seed of the woman who's to come, right? We can, the latter day blessing of this seed who's to come, to conquer all the peoples and to bring in basically eternal blessedness, really. We see all this focus there. Why does this story drop into the middle, right in the middle of Joseph's going to Potiphar's house? Joseph sold into slavery. They're on their way to Egypt. Why? Why does it drop in there? What's that?
Does that something to do with the famine thing that, like we were mentioning before, God uses these other nations, the other people, to save the Israelites? If God doesn't do that, seed drops off.
Yeah, I think so. I think Joseph's story, if you look at this, is that Israel is going to Israel. I want you to hear this. Jacob, when I say Jacob or Israel, through his sons, particularly his son Joseph, is going to bless all nations, isn't he? Israel, through his sons, is going to bless all nations. He's going to bless Egypt. He's going to bless Israel. He's going to bless all nations. And you have the story of Israel as this growing nation in the context, really, of the eschatological story of Judah's coming son, the Messiah. In other words, here's how God is working to grow the people of Israel, to bless the nations around them, and to bring them to really the next part of the story, which is they're not going to conquer just yet, right? They're not going to conquer just yet. And Judah's, what you have to know in the midst of this, is all of this is still happening, while the reason all this is happening is to bring about this one seed of the woman. You guys follow that? So we're telling you the story, but don't forget, as we get into the story about Joseph, this is about bringing the seed of the woman. I read a scholar, I told you guys this last week, Jeff Afonso sent me a biblical theology article about a guy who complained about biblical theology being overly focused on the Christ and not focused enough on Israel. And he actually said the focus of the book of Genesis is on how Israel gets to Egypt. It's really the point of the whole book, how Israel gets to Egypt. There you go. And I think to myself, have you read the book of Genesis? Is there the story of how Israel gets to Egypt in the book of Genesis? For sure. Is it the point? Is the point? Because if we miss Judah's story here, what's happening in chapter 38 and then 49 in the blessing, if we miss that, then we miss the point even of Joseph's story. You guys follow that? Because Joseph's story is a story of God preserving the offspring of Judah. He's preserving him through Joseph and Egypt. You guys follow that? Okay, so... And in spite of Judah's sin, and in spite of the sin of the brothers of Joseph, etc., Joseph acts as a kind of deliverer for Israel, doesn't he? In this scene. So let's return again to the story of Joseph and try to wrap it up quickly. I'm like I said, I'm not going to tell you a lot in that story, but I want to sort of wrap it in quickly. Before I jump back into Genesis 37 through 50 in the story, though, I want to back up to Genesis 15 and ask the question, why doesn't God just let them conquer these areas right now? Genesis chapter 15. I just want to remind you of this. I emphasized it when we were here, but I want to remind you of it. In Genesis 15, God puts Abraham to sleep, if you guys remember, and he has this vision where God's covenanting with him with the smoking fire pot going between the pieces of the animals, and he's covenanting with them. And one of the things he tells them, in verse 13, then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. He's talking about Egypt. Okay, he's talking about Egypt. Why are they going to go in Egypt for 400 years? But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. In other words, I'm going to judge Egypt, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here, that's to Canaan, in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So why are they going to go into Egypt for 400 years? Because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when they're going to come out, what are they going to do? They're going to be commanded to destroy the Amorites. Their iniquity is complete. In other words, God's patience is not up with them yet. But his patience will be. You have to keep that context in mind when they come in and God says slaughter those people. And you say, what kind of thing is that for God to do? God was patient with them. For hundreds of years, they would not repent. They persisted in their idolatry. So this is wipe them out. But it's partially why they're in Egypt for so long. So Joseph is leading them in to this 400-year stay in Egypt. Joseph's leading them in. And we read from Genesis 37 through 50 the story of Israel blessing the nations and becoming itself established as a great nation, don't we? There's more to tell in the story, but I want to jump forward. Look to Genesis 45. Genesis 45. Where we're going to learn that the sin of Joseph's brothers was planned by God to preserve Israel. Interestingly enough, Egypt would be the seed of the serpent, and God is even using the seed of the serpent to bless Israel. But look there, Genesis 45 and verse 4. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Isn't that interesting? You sold me, but God was sending me for you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth. That is no small word in the Old Testament, the remnant of Israel on earth. A remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. How many times does he say that to them? But God, he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. See, the Lord has sent me here to preserve the remnant of Israel on the earth. So what's he there for? To preserve the remnant of Israel. So that who could come? Judah's greater son. Ultimately. Go to Genesis chapter 50 really quickly after reading Genesis 45, 5 through 8 with this repeated emphasis on the fact that the Lord is the one who sent him there. Just chapter 50 and verse 20, speaking to his brothers again. Verse 19, we'll start there. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are to this day." See, we learn that the sin of Joseph's brothers was planned by God to preserve Israel. And what's fascinating is the Lord is even using the real serpent nation, Egypt, to preserve Israel. It is, in fact, in the context of that serpentine nation that Israel flourishes. They're given land. And then we read in Genesis that that first they're small, we read in Genesis, but they're starting to reproduce there, right? You guys remember that? When you come to the beginning of Exodus, they've become so great that Pharaoh's overwhelmed with their numbers, right? They're in the land of Goshen. All right, now look at chapter 46 and verse 1. I want to come back to this promise of seed and land that comes in. So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices. By the way, Israel's Jacob. Came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to God and of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here am I." Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. For there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So I'm going to give you this land and this seed I promised in Egypt. Right? Now, and then it's going to be what? Out of Egypt that I call my son. Right? Exodus chapter 4, Israel is my firstborn son. Hosea chapter 11, out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew chapter 2, Jesus goes down into Egypt, and it's said of him, this is to fulfill what was prophesied by Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son. There's no mistake in this language, folks. Genesis 46 and verse 8 and following, we then read, now these are the names of the descendants of Israel who came into Egypt. And then we read this list of 70 names. 70 descendants. And the question is, are there 70 descendants to replace the 70 nations that are listed in Genesis 10? Right? In other words, is there an allusion to the beginning of the reversal of Babel here? It's one of the questions that comes in. I don't know. You can chew on that. But it's interesting. There's 70 in Genesis 10, and there's 70 here. And there's a lot more to do with that number 70, by the way. How many, after Jesus sends out his 12, how many does he send out? 70. Right? And it becomes an interesting kind of thing. I don't have time to get into that either today. Genesis 47, I want you to see the irony of a weak Israel blessing powerful Egypt. Verse 7, then Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojournings are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. That is a strange thing, isn't it? Twice it emphasizes Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Understand, Israel, who's reading this, coming out of Egypt. And here's the father, one of their forefathers, right, who's blessing the Pharaoh, right? And you have this picture, really this ironic picture of a weak Israel, a weak Jacob, this weak, tiny nation who's now going to be in subjection, blessing the most powerful leader on the earth. And when you're offering the blessing, you're standing in that place of really the powerful one, aren't you? It's interesting imagery. So we see this, my point is we're seeing this emphasis on Israel as this nation that blesses other nations. Right? All right, Genesis chapter 50, let's wrap up there. Because I want to get the people in the land. It's important that we get them buried in the right place. Right? Jacob and Joseph are both going to be buried in Canaan. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 5. My father made me swear, saying, I'm about to die in my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan. There you shall bury me. And so, in other words, this is Joseph coming to Pharaoh saying, I need to take my father, Jacob, to the land of Canaan to bury him. He can't be buried here in Egypt. Now, though the people reproduce in Egypt for 400 years and grow as a strong nation there, the burial of the fathers does not take place there. They're buried in Canaan. Jacob's buried in Canaan. And when you get toward the end of Genesis chapter 50, look at verse 24. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Because he's going to die in Egypt, and he's telling them, he's prophesying, God's going to come. He's going to take you out of this land. And look what he says. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And what ends up happening? They end up carrying him back into the land. In other words, the family was continue to be buried in the land. Here's the point. Jacob and Joseph are buried in Canaan, their land, yet Israel is left in the wrong land with a small number, but the seed persists. You guys follow? They're left in the wrong land in Egypt, and it's small in number. The number will change in Exodus, by the way. When we pick up Exodus, they're going to suddenly be great in number. All these years have passed, and now they're great in number. But they're in the wrong land, small in number, but the seed is persisting. This is what's being told to you from Genesis 37 through 50. They're in the wrong land, they're small in number, but the seed is persisting. The seed is still going to come. Seed of the woman is still coming. They're still going to be a blessing to all nations. They're still going to get their land and the seed. You guys follow me on that? Land, seed, blessing are still happening and coming. Tom Schreiner, whose book, The King in His Beauty, which is a whole Bible biblical theology, which I recommend you read. If you want a summer read, The King in His Beauty by Schreiner is worth your time. It's long. But it does a good job overviewing the Bible story fairly simply. But it's anyway, he says this, and I think it's helpful. The preservation of the offspring clearly was the Lord's work. Here he's summarizing Genesis to some degree. The preservation of the offspring clearly was the Lord's work. For Abraham's family survived despite barrenness, sin, stupidity, squabbles, and famine. Genesis teaches that the kingdom will come, for it ultimately depends upon the Lord. It will be realized through his promise rather than human virtue. You guys hear that? That kind of summarizes this. And I think that's a helpful summary. The preservation of the offspring clearly was the Lord's work, for Abraham's family survived despite barrenness, sin, stupidity, squabbles, and famine. The kingdom will come, and it depends on the Lord to bring it. Through promise, not through human virtue. Okay. All right, any questions? When we come back, we'll pick up Exodus. Any questions? Yes, sir.
How significant is God using Gentile women in preserving the seed?
I think it's very significant. And I would say it's, and even sinful situations. I think it's significant on a number of levels, but the pickup of that in Matthew's genealogy is no small thing. To throw women into a genealogy, by the way, folks, go through the genealogies in the Old Testament and look for how many women are in them. To throw women into a genealogy, and then the particular women, really women who are scandalous in some way. And what was Rahab? Right? And Gentile and not a particularly virtuous one. She does end up believing in the covenant God of Israel. Right? Tamar, Gentile woman. Right? Not particularly virtuous in some ways, but is believing in the promise. You know, you come forward to Ruth. Gentile woman, pretty virtuous actually. She's the virtuous one of the group. She believes in the covenant God of Israel. That's the emphasis in Ruth chapter 1. Naomi is a schemer and kind of just a dishonest person in general, right? I mean, go when Boaz is there on the threshing floor and, they lay naked under those blankets. Crawl under the blanket. He'll tell you what to do from there, honey, right? I mean, that's what she did. You know what she's hitting at there, And so anyway, you see that whole situation, and then you come forward to Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, and there's a clear focus on the scandal there. So you have both scandal in the line of Christ and Gentile women in the line of Christ, which seems to be continually focusing you on a couple of things. One, this is coming through promise and not through human virtue, this seed. Coming through promise and not through human virtue. Two, this seed of the woman is not only going to bless Israel, he's going to bless the nations. Manuel?
Is there any importance in the chapter of Judah and Tamar, or early on, there's clearly called out that it's the kinsman redeemer, sons, that kinsman redeemer, even though they turned out to be wicked.
You mean because of what you mean, the call for that? I mean, only just so that you know that's part of the history of Israel, I think. I'm not sure, because that son, the kinsman redeemer's son, he's wicked. I mean, in the most vile possible way. No, I won't give my brother's wife a child, but I will sleep with her repeatedly. And basically use her sexually and then, right? I mean, he's pretty vile. So, very different than Boaz, who treats Ruth incredibly respectfully, though he has an opportunity to take advantage of her, obviously, in chapter 3 of Ruth. Doesn't, right, has the opportunity and treats her respectfully and redeems her. It's a very different story. But, yes, sir?
So what's the summary of why chapter 38 is dropped in there?
I think the summary is that Joseph's story is a story that's being told about how God is preserving the seed of Judah, who will be the seed of the woman, the Messiah. I think that's the summary. I think it's dropped in there because the real emphasis is not on Joseph. The real emphasis is on Judah's son. And this whole story is about how Judah's son, Israel, really, I mean, the people who eventually you get down to Christ, get into Egypt and are going to be brought out. This whole story is running toward him. This son who will redeem Israel and all the nations. And you pick that up throughout the Pentateuch, by the way, as the emphasis continues on Judah's family. And then, by the way, you pick it up when you get into the Kings, Samuel and the Kings as well, because it's got to be from Judah's line that David comes, right? And then eventually the Christ. So I think if I were really going to be emphasizing, maybe it's more accurate to say Genesis 37 through 50 is really the story of Judah and his son, whom, and you say, well, it's mostly about Joseph. Yeah, but it's about how God uses Joseph to preserve Israel so that the seed of Judah can come. So anyway, any other questions? Hopefully this is helpful as we've surveyed Genesis. I think we spent 9 or 10 weeks on Genesis. We can't do that with every book because then it would take 660 weeks to finish. That's a lot of sessions. But we'll try to narrow it down from here. Some books will get bigger in our time. When we get to a prophet like Isaiah, we're going to have to spend more time than we would, maybe we might go over 1st, 2nd Kings pretty quickly, right? Or Chronicles. So, and further in the Bible story, right? Okay. You guys want to do, like I said, summer reading, King and His Beauty by Shriner's worthwhile as a summer read. If you're wanting one, if you're just wanting to understand biblical theology more, Hamilton's little book, What is Biblical Theology, will help you some with that. Hamilton's book, God's Glory and Salvation Through Judgment, also worth reading. So they're both kind of quick reads, right? So they're actually both pretty basic reads. They're trying to make it popularize. They're trying to popularize that, but they're long. So anyway, those are big overviews. All right, and if you really want to take on a beast, not long, but a beast, Voss's Biblical Theology. VOS. That's how you spell his last name.
It's small. It's thin.
It's only about 400 pages, 300 or 400 pages. It's just pretty technical. It's meaty. Yeah, to say the least. So, but he is the father of modern biblical theology. It's worth reading. All right. Anybody want to pray for us before I close?